waiting for some panelists to run.
Where are our panelists?
They're running here, hopefully, preserving the mental health. Maybe you can give us a quick intro of what you'll be talking here on the panel discussion.
Yeah, sure. Hey everybody, we're going to talk about psychedelics in mental health. So we're talking not about, party drugs on the weekends, which, I live in Berlin, so that's quite common for a lot of people. Rather, we're going to talk about the use of psychedelic drugs or psychotropics for conditions where they may be drug resistant, or conversely, the side effects of drugs mean that the adherence to taking drugs regularly has not really worked.
That's very interesting. So the topic of mental health, and I'm searching with one eye for our speakers. The topic of mental health is quite big, but there is some stigma about psychedelics oftenly. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's poorly understood because a lot of people's reference point is those illicit party drugs, or it's the 60s with the idea that they're used in, treating people in very severe PTSD, like returned soldiers. And then, what happened after that? How much smarter have the drugs got? How have been able to control that kind of, like control dosage and things like that, and to really get those regulated. So we're going to learn about all that stuff. And guess what? Our panelists are here.
Amazing. I will leave you with the panelists.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
That's okay. We look after our mental health too, so they might have needed a caffeine hit. Alrighty. I might start. I'm just going to turn my chair slightly, otherwise I keep doing this, and it's, not great. Tom and Clara, welcome to the stage. I guess I'll start with some intros. Would you like to introduce yourself first?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you very much. My name's Tom McDonald. I'm the founder of a company called Clerkenwell Health, which is a British-based startup. We've been running for about 2.5 years now. And what we do is we're helping a number of different drug developers, specifically in the psychedelic space, with the design of their clinical trials, trying to get them approved by the regulators, and then ultimately we're moving into the delivery of them as well. So we're opening up a series of trial units because we don't think hospitals are a desperately good place to be doing large amounts of psychedelics. And so we're opening up our own trial units through which we're actually moving into the delivery of these studies.
Great. And Clara?
I'm Clara Burtenshaw. I'm a partner and co-founder of Kuma Ventures. We're Europe's first and largest VC fund specializing in psychedelic healthcare, and we invest across 3 different verticals. So the first is drug development, drug discovery, and then we're also investing across clinics and care delivery, and then picks and tools, ancillary services and infrastructure that's desperately needed to make sure that patients are given the right level of care when they're receiving psychedelic healthcare.
Maybe you could start, Tom, by just walking us through the landscape a little bit. What kind of substances are being used, and what are they being used to treat? Absolutely.
So there is a very wide variety of potentials that fall into the wider psychedelics category. On the periphery, you've got things like ketamine, which are actually already available on prescription in most markets globally at the moment. That's called a dissociative, typically, so not what I would call a traditional psychedelic. Within the kind of more traditional psychedelics, you've got things like psilocybin, which is active ingredient in magic mushrooms. You've got LSD, and then there is a plethora of new chemical entities coming through at the moment as well, which are quite exciting. And the final one that's really of note is MDMA, which is actually the most advanced in terms of the clinical trials that it's been through. It's been through 2 phase 3s in the US, for PTSD, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that. But I think the thing to say is because of the mechanism of action here, they seem to be working across the full gamut of mental health conditions, PTSD, depression, anxiety, eating disorders. And we're even starting to see some interesting stuff coming through dementia, Alzheimer's, and even pain as well. So it's really quite an exciting space at the moment.
Yeah, there's just one thing I might add to that, which is ketamine is available off-label at the moment. So whilst it's on the UN WHO essential medicines list and it's used as an anesthetic, it has been used to treat depression because it produces very rapid antidepressant effects, and it's been particularly useful for people suffering from suicidal ideation. And it's also become really the kind of the beginning of the industry in some ways, because we've seen this plethora of ketamine clinics emerging in the US. That's where people are receiving most of the sort of in-clinic psychedelic experiences. And that's where a lot of technology companies that are creating products for the area are starting to use their technology to treat patients. And then as we expect MDMA and psilocybin to become regulated medicines, then they will hope to extend their services to those medicines as well.
And where are we at when we talk about regulations? Like, what's legal? I assume we're talking mostly about trials, but also in terms of dispensement by other health practitioners. Either of you.
I'll make a start. So yeah, it's worth sort of noting there are almost distinct parts to psychedelics industry as a whole. So certainly myself, exclusively working in the pure play pharmaceutical, which will very much follow the same pathway for getting a drug approved that you would have for any other non-psychedelic compound. But we are definitely seeing some sort of international shifts at the moment. So there's a bunch of states in the US that have decriminalized or are in the process of decriminalizing, which means that people can almost go on retreats and get kind of supported therapy that way. Similarly, you know, Australia has done quite a similar model recently. And I don't think Europe will go that route. I think we're going to be quite pure play pharmaceutical for at least the next sort of 10 years or so. But you know, the global movement is definitely away from the sort of war on drugs, which doesn't seem to be working. And we will probably see some wider opening outside of medical uses, is my take.
Yeah, especially in the US, I think we're really seeing a patchwork of different approaches across the states. So you can look at Oregon, Colorado as places where they're experimenting with legalization. And even though, you know, on a federal level, it's still illegal to possess and use these substances. And we've seen different approaches in South Africa. They've respected a constitutional right to use psilocybin. And then we've seen other countries across Europe where there are exemptions, like, for example, in the Netherlands. That's where you'll see clinics emerging from a European perspective.
And when we talk about legalization or decriminalization in a, I guess, more of a healthcare setting in our context today, in some of those places, are we talking about a situation where people are able to get, I guess, for want of a better word, pharmacy-grade drugs, where there's a consistent dosage and it's been tested? Or is it still a little bit Wild West?
Yeah, no, it's very much tightly regulated.
Yeah.
If we're talking about the industry I'm in, that medical pharmaceutical one, there is a range of regulatory, and it's a good thing. We want those regulations there because you want the drugs to be safe. You want them to be consistent. And so there is a lot of red tape. That's something that we've been working through for, you know, almost a year and a half now to make sure that everything is fit and ready to make sure that when patients are coming in, they're going to be as safe as they possibly can be. And that's obviously in the trial space, but as and when they're getting approved, the likely model in most countries, I suspect, will be you'll only be able to access these if a specialist, i.e. a psychiatrist, deems that they're going to be relevant for you. And then you're likely to need to go to, again, a specialist centre for the actual delivery of them as well. So there's specialist staff and processes, et cetera, to just make sure everything is as safe and secure as it can be.
Yeah, and I think another thing to add to that is when you see these substances in nature, the level of the psychoactive compound varies from, you know, mushroom to mushroom, for example. And what is happening with the synthetic pharma model that's currently being investigated is we'll have this sort of controlled dose so that we know exactly how much a patient is receiving when they're being dosed. We have this ability to dose up in a controlled way. The regulator likes this approach because quite often there's a de-risking that goes through the pharma development process. We know, for example, there are some risks around the 5-HT2B receptor, people with pre-existing heart conditions. We have companies that are looking at how you can dial down that risk and therefore produce a more optimized drug with a safer target product profile for patients. And what that also means is it lends itself ultimately to reimbursement. So once you've got an approved drug that's recognized in this way, then it means that patients can actually have their treatments paid for. And we've recently seen in the US actually that MAPS and Compass Pathways got their reimbursement codes. So I think that's a really, really positive step towards ensuring that we get the access that we need for patients.
Interesting. And I guess one thing I was interested on your website, Tom, it talks about also, as well as testing drugs or clinical trials, there is also the therapeutic element of therapy or counselling. Can you maybe explain a bit more about that for us?
Yeah, I think that's, in our mind anyway, everyone's got a slightly different position on this, but certainly the way we look at it at Clerkenwell is that psychedelics in large doses, we're talking here, rather than kind of microdosing long-term usage. Typically, the approach people are taking is that you'll do some kind of preparatory sessions before you undertake the dose. So you kind of start building an alliance, they call it, with your therapist. Also maybe starting to unpick some of the issues that you want to explore when you're on the dose. And so having a really well-trained therapist for that is vital. And then having a therapist that will follow you through, be there when you're undergoing the dose, which for some people is a very powerful and overwhelming experience, is absolutely vital to make sure they have as positive a time as they can. But absolutely vitally, to my mind, is what they call integration. And that can take weeks or potentially even months. And again, it's making sure that you've got a therapist or somebody on hand to turn to if you've got some of those issues that bubbled up in the dose. How do you actually take lessons from them and really kind of build that into positive thought patterns and most importantly behaviors, so that it becomes a kind of a long-term fix rather than just a jolly experience or indeed a really tough experience.
I think that's really sort of what makes psychedelics so groundbreaking at the moment, is that usually when the FDA and the EMA are being asked to review the safety and efficacy of a drug, they're looking at just that, the medicine, the drug that's being developed. But now for the first time, those bodies are being asked to look at the development of a protocol, a therapeutic protocol that goes hand in hand alongside the development of the drug. And that's something that they haven't been asked to do before. They're not familiar with this. It's raised a lot of questions, and it means that the industry has really had to also ask itself a lot of questions about what makes therapy safe. What sort of training do we need for therapists to ensure that we are maintaining high standards of patient care throughout the process? Ethical questions about what their training should look like, their experience, and also what to do when something goes wrong. So I think it's really a special moment for this industry and also for healthcare and pharma, really, that this is a very unique proposition. But it's also, depending on how you see it, some people think it's the mechanism of action that makes psychedelics successful as a treatment for patients. Other people think it's really the way it turbocharges the efficacy of the therapy by building that therapeutic alliance, making patients more open to treatment, and creating long-lasting change through disrupting ingrained negative thought processes, patterns, and behaviors.
I guess one thing I was thinking about was, so far, what's been the most promising treatment, and what condition has been most responsive?
Do you want to start?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, we've got two really exciting trial results that are happening. So the first is MAPS's development of MDMA therapy for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. That has been quite an interesting and challenging journey, I think, in some ways, because they had one phase 3 trial. So when you're developing drugs, you go through phase 1, if that's successful, phase 2, and then phase 3. So phase 3 is the last phase that you would go through before the regulator has to review whether they legalize that drug. And MAPS had, in their first phase 3 result, a 68% remission rate for people going through that treatment. Now, that is just completely unheard of in psychiatry. We don't see results like that. And these were patients, many of whom were veterans, who had really ingrained PTSD, had been through a number of unsuccessful treatments in the past. And those results were so promising that actually MAPS were asked to redo that phase 3 trial because they wanted to make sure that they had that the data had been collated properly and that the analysis was correct. So they've now done that second phase 3 trial. The results will be published in the summer, but from conversations with them, it looks like those results have been emulated. So that's really exciting. It means that the FDA will need to review that treatment over the next year or two. And that means that will likely be the first psychedelic treatment that will hit the market. They've got a very advanced commercialization plan, a plan to train enough therapists to be able to deliver that treatment. They're talking about needing 30,000 therapists to begin with. And then we've also got another exciting treatment that's being developed, which is Compass Pathways, who have, they're a NASDAQ-listed company. They have developed a synthetic form of psilocybin, which is a psychoactive component in a magic mushroom. And with that, they're looking to treat treatment-resistant depression. So that's when a patient has failed 2 types of depression treatments. They get bucketed in this category of treatment-resistant depression. And they've had incredibly good results with that, looking like 30% remission for patients, which is very high, but also long-lasting remission. And that's in phase 2, going into phase 3. So I think those are really the 2 key trials that will raise the tide for psychedelics and what everyone is really waiting for in the market.
Amazing.
Yeah, and just in case anyone's not sure of the term remission, I think it's worth just touching on that as well, because this is, to me, the most exciting thing about psychedelics. Rather than being put on an antidepressant for years, potentially even life, right? And all of the side effects that come with that. These treatments are hopefully one-offs. You know, you have that course of therapy, you have your dose or series of doses over a period of anywhere between 1 and let's say 3 months. And then what Clara's touching on there is actually you're looking at 12 months, so a year after that treatment, people are still better. And that to me is what's really, really exciting.
That's amazing.
Getting people
say,
out of that
wow.
constant rut.
Yeah.
They might need top-up doses and things like that, but nowhere near the frequency that you would expect with traditional treatments for depression.
And what about conditions where traditionally the treatment is about taking drugs very long-term, maybe something like schizophrenia or bipolar? Has there been any development in those areas?
Schizophrenia is a bit of a hot topic, really. It's typically in any of the trials we've worked on, it's actually what we call an exclusion criteria. So it's one where we'd say you won't be eligible for this trial just because we don't want to take any risks of triggering it getting worse.
Yeah.
However, bipolar and borderline personality disorder, some of these other ones that are incredibly complex, eating disorders as well, right, which and addictions even. These are things that presently there's not really a drug on the market. There's therapy, and that works for a relatively small subset. But if we can, and they're much earlier phase in terms of the trials, but it is looking promising, and they will be an amazing nut to crack, so to speak, when we get there.
That's great.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note as well that these treatments don't work for everyone. And so, you touched on a really important point there, Tom, which is there are a number of exclusion criteria that apply to screen patients to make sure that they should be receiving these treatments. So one is a history of schizophrenia within the family, because it is known for people who have a propensity towards it, it could trigger psychosis. Also, as I mentioned earlier, issue around heart conditions as well. And we just really kind of scratching the surface, I think, on research of the topic. We need to invest in more research, more clinical trials to really understand. And I think a particularly exciting area actually is around predictive precision medicine. So if we can find out whether a patient is likely to respond to the drug through the use of biomarkers, for example, that would be great, because what we see so much with the treatment of depression and CNS is that not everyone responds, and it can be incredibly demoralizing, make you feel even more depressed if you're a non-responder and you've pinned all of your hopes on this particular treatment. And so if there's a way of finding out whether you are likely to be within that category of responder or not non-responder before you're given the treatment, that would be great. And I think that's also the case really across depression. What we're seeing at the moment with the use of antidepressants is that people typically receive a first-line choice of antidepressant when they go and see their doctor. that might not necessarily be the right one for them. They might experience side effects, impact their lives, and then they get put onto a different one. And then before they know it, that doesn't work, and then they're a treatment-resistant depression case. And actually, they were just given the wrong medicine to begin with. So I think, if we look at psychedelics as this sort of more holistic, natural way of treating people, we should be looking at, who should be receiving those treatments and what kind of new technologies and precision medicine approach we can take to make sure that they receive those treatments.
And I'm curious how people break into these trials. I know in my family, schizophrenia is unfortunately quite common. My brother, my father, both have schizophrenia. And, I know for them there's been issues about drug resistance taking drugs. So how do you get people to enter a trial? Are people just like they've tried everything and they just want to try something else? Or is there another entry way?
Yeah, this is quite unique to psychedelics. So actually, mental health trials typically are a very, very hard population to recruit for clinical trials for the reasons you've kind of touched on. There's a frustration with the beds they've had. There's the fact that maybe they simply don't want to be going in and out of a hospital that they don't need to, and a myriad of other reasons. But funnily enough, for us in psychedelics, I think because of the press and some of the positive sentiment around it, almost the reverse challenge is now true for us, where we put an advert out for a study and we will have maybe 50 applicants for every 5 that are actually going to be eligible. Some people want to give psychedelics a go and they think there's a nice safe environment to do it in. And then, for all of the inclusion and exclusion things that we've touched on as well, there's a number of reasons that we have to discount. So we have a really robust process with questionnaires, then we have nurses calling and running through, and then of course they come in and meet a psychiatrist and and it's a pretty in-depth process to make sure that nobody's landing on the trial that shouldn't be for whatever reason.
That's definitely been our experience, which is that you put out an advert for a trial for depression, you get a few people responding, you update the advert and include the word ketamine, and then suddenly the entire student body of the university wants to take part in the trial. So it's there's something about it that captures the imagination, for sure.
I can see that happening in Berlin, unfortunately. You would have a captive audience for pretty much every trial, unfortunately. Yeah. And Clara, from an investment standpoint, you're obviously looking at companies where there is obviously a very strong scientific background. They're probably academia. There's been peer reviews. They've already been able to, validate some of their claims, etc. How do you approach this from an investment standpoint?
It depends on what vertical that we're looking at. But if we're looking at drug discovery, drug development, we're typically looking for 3 things. So the first is an excellent team. By that, people who've had actual hands-on experience of delivering drugs to market, developing them, excellent clinical trial design, required a pharma team who know also how to sell the story, because that's so important. It's not just about having the science, the data, and developing the drug. You need to be able to license these products. You need to be able to have conversations with pharma, and you need to be able to sell it. So we're looking for that. We're also looking for top-tier intellectual property, and by that we mean we typically as a fund don't invest in synthetic forms of generically available drugs. So a company that's looking to create a synthetic form of what's already available in nature isn't really our area. What we're looking for is drug optimization. So where chemists are looking to enhance what's already available in nature and create novel IP, so novel composition of matter, new chemical entities. That's what we particularly like. And we also have to be really excited about the product. And by that I mean, what's already available on the market to treat that particular disease, how many people are suffering, how would this product be an improvement on what's already available, whether it's got a better side effect profile or fewer doses required, or any aspect that might mean that people are more likely to adhere to the treatment. So that's the drug discovery side. And then when we're looking at clinics and care delivery, we're looking for people who've got experience of healthcare, which is such a nuanced area. You really need to know, a lot about not only how to deliver those treatments safely, but your role within the wider healthcare ecosystem. And then on technology, I mean, that's such a wide field. We're investing in anything from virtual reality to biomarker and neuroscience-driven music generation platforms to optimize the patient experience, to a lot of, how do we better monitor patients both during their treatments and especially afterwards? Are there ways that we can preempt relapse or nudge patients to seek treatment and care before they might realize they need it? And there's a lot that can be done with digital phenotyping, tracking people's mobile phone usage, and things like that. So there, it's all about the team, the drive, the passion, the why. Why are they doing this? Much like, investing in tech.
Mm. And I mean, how much does remote medicine or telemedicine come into it? I mean, you mentioned it as a factor, and we know that COVID made a pretty pivotal shift there.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a huge move towards digital wards during COVID, which has really stayed and stuck. People are used to now, seeking treatment through their mobile phone, receiving therapy sessions digitally. What the research is showing us is that actually digital delivery of therapy is no less efficacious than in person. That's incredible because it means that we're able to link up therapists with people who might not otherwise be able to seek therapy, depending on their location or mobility issues. And what it also means from a sort of teletherapy, telemedicine model is that there were quite a few exemptions that ran through COVID, like the Ryan Haight exemption that a lot of the US telemedicine companies relied on. So there, prior to COVID, you would have had a face-to-face appointment in order to receive a prescription. That got relaxed during COVID. It's now actually, they've now reinforced it. But during that period, that's where we saw a lot of the pop-up of telemedicine companies that were sort of operating this mail-order system of ketamine with arguably very loose screening protocols. It's not a model we like or we've invested in. But we have invested in sort of hybrid clinics and digital services. One example of that is a company called Journey Clinical, operating in the US. They're operating a decentralized clinic model. They're kind of doing two things. So the first is that they're sort of a ZocDoc, if you will, for patients who are looking to receive treatment. They don't know where to turn. They don't want to go to the sort of the underground market. And there they can find a directory of vetted, onboarded, qualified psychotherapists who are using ketamine treatments. They also provide a prescription service for psychotherapists to be able to administer ketamine treatments to patients. And then they're also providing clinic services because there are a lot of independent therapists out there doing this who want the sort of safety and comfort of a clinic, but they're sort of mum and pop operators who don't have that. And what we've seen with that is that they've really taken a patient-first, patient-safety approach, which means that they're riding out this sort of telemedicine exemption problem that other providers are facing. And that's also something that the market has supported. So we were the first and largest ticket into their pre-seed round. And then we found in the subsequent round, 50 years backing them, and lately Union Square Ventures backing them. So what we're also seeing is that across the wider VC market, the generalist funds are really interested in psychedelics, but they don't really want to dip their toes into the nuanced area of drug development. They'll invest into business models they can wrap their heads around. So more of the kind of clinic, hybrid clinic and technology space.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, because that's something that we've just invested in, even from the trials perspective as well. So these are Schedule 1 drugs still. I don't see anytime soon us being able to deliver LSD to the home. So we've got this platform now, or bidding for a platform, that will allow us to do all of our therapy wherever possible remotely, only bringing the patient actually in for the dose. As you said, if you've got severe depression, we've spoken to many patient groups about this. The last thing they want to be doing is traipsing in and out of London, frankly, getting on public transport, et cetera, et cetera. So really taking that patient-first stance and figuring out what is their actual pain points for being on a clinical trial and how can we solve them with technology. And ultimately, that will bleed into when we're running clinics as well, I think.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about was we know historically and probably globally there's been a significant lack of investment in mental health from governments. and healthcare, the people that fund the bigger stuff. I mean, how will this be able to scale to, a more public health setting?
It's an interesting question. I've been doing the rounds a little bit in the UK with the government over the past couple of months. So there is, I think COVID sort of triggered in a lot of people's minds that there is this mental health epidemic at the moment. And I think certainly in the UK and a number of other European countries, governments are starting to take it a bit more seriously. What I think they will struggle with is embedding psychedelics within the existing frameworks and hospitals and so on that they've got. So what I'm speaking to them about at the moment is actually us potentially trying to help them set up small units, whether they're standalone or whether they're part of a hospital, where we can start training up therapists in the first instance, waiting for the drugs to get approved, from back end of next year potentially. Well, that's in the US, probably another year behind in Europe. And just gradually trying to mainstream this in the minds of the people that are ultimately going to matter, the psychiatrists, the psychotherapists, and of course the regulators. But it will be slow, I suspect, for big national operations to pick it up. So I think private might pick up the slack in the short term.
Yeah, I think it's one other thing to note is that psychedelic healthcare treatment for something like depression is very different to your typical just take a tablet once a day approach because of the therapy element that's required. That does make it a more expensive treatment because you're having to factor in therapist time as well as the cost of the drug. We don't know exactly how many therapist sessions might be required for a particular patient, so there's an unknown there. It means it's a slightly different model to what big pharma's used to or comfortable with. And therefore requires, these types of specialist units. But I think, there's an opportunity for technology to really play a role. And what we're seeing is that, as Tom mentioned, you have a number of preparation sessions, you have your dose sessions, and you have your integration sessions where you're unpacking the insights and what you experienced during your psychedelic trip with a therapist who helps you uncover the meaning. And actually, some of the preparation sessions could be done virtually, remotely, through virtual reality as well. You don't necessarily need to have a face-to-face therapist session for that. You could also have preparation explanation done in a group setting where you've got 6 to 8 patients with a therapist. There are ways that we can use technology to help treat people remotely and in groups that would significantly reduce the economic burden of delivering this treatment to patients. And that's the area that we're really excited in investing in. It's the infrastructure that's required to deliver the treatments in an economic way that works. And I think there's a really exciting role potentially for insurance tech as well to play here.
Interesting. And I mean, how long is it until we see health professionals like perhaps psych nurses or psychologists, therapists, having this embedded into their training from that kind of foundational level?
Well, I think we're probably a little way off. So we're sort of striking a partnership with an NHS trust at the moment.
Great.
Which will be the first one. That's on psychotherapist training, specific to psychedelics. I think realistically, we're quite a long way off of that being part of, if you're becoming a doctor or a psychiatrist, that being baked into your day-to-day academic training. But absolutely, there's already groups out there doing some of this therapy style training. The issue that they're going to have is making sure that it speaks the same language as the medical community does today, rather than the maybe slightly more spiritual or other kind of influences that this whole space has had on it. And so the meeting of those worlds is a tricky one, but I think it's something that we're really, really keen to kind of help drive on, certainly in the UK and potentially further afield.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think you really, what the industry really needs is the most boring person in the room to be presenting the topic, because psychedelics, he's here. Psychedelics does attract, your kind of evangelists who talk about all of the wonderful things about the treatment and perhaps gloss over the risks. I think we need to take a data-driven, evidence-based approach to looking at these treatments. I'm excited about the progress that's being made here, but I think there's a real difference between your kind of older guard of psychiatrists who's been practicing for decades and actually young psychiatrists today, because when I speak to young psychiatrists at the NHS, they're really excited about psychedelics, and they say, you know, the problem is our toolkit at the moment to treat people is so limited. They're frankly embarrassed at what they're able to prescribe to patients, and they see the data and they see the results, and they're really excited about this new horizon in treatment for patients. So I think part of it will be this need to have a robust education policy. What we saw with cannabis and medical cannabis is that legislation changed, but actually governments didn't go far enough in training GPs and doctors that these treatments are available, how to prescribe them, and to make them cost effective. So what we saw with medical cannabis is that sadly, you know, it is available in the UK, but I think they've written about 6 prescriptions. And then you've still got, you know, poor patients going and doing deals with their local drug dealer in a McDonald's car park because they can't get access through the National Healthcare Service. So I think it's important that we have the training, the education, but I think a lot will happen over time with younger psychiatrists becoming more senior and choosing to prescribe these treatments once they're available.
Amazing.
Yeah, I absolutely second that. We speak to a lot of clinicians at the moment, and the psychiatrists are desperate for new tools, you know, absolutely desperate. And I think that's an international phenomenon. So long as the data keeps building up, keeps stacking up, they'll be there to listen when it comes through.
I'm going to ask a random question because it just pops into my head. That happens to me. So, I mean, when you're talking about organic substances, how are they procured? I mean, you're not going out to a park and digging your mushrooms or something?
No. Again, because this is like pure pharma play, you have some pretty crazy facilities. If we're talking about mushrooms that are, well, they're not greenhouses. They're black houses, I suppose. Yeah, very dark room. But it all needs to be what's GMP, so good manufacturing processes, so that every single mushroom that comes out of there is consistent, essentially. And then typically it won't be a dried mushroom. You're usually doing an extract from that so that you can further ensure the consistency.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we're also seeing new technologies emerge so at the moment, you know, there are cultivators out there who are growing psilocybin organically, but we're also seeing the emergence of new technologies, biosynthesis, for example, being applied to create these medicines, and which is a much more green, less waste approach. Companies like Ultramarine Bio, Silink, CEOs in the audience today, really exciting things that are emerging in the space.
Alrighty.
Yeah, I got a little crash course in that earlier. I strongly suggest having a chat because
so interesting.
It's fascinating. Using yeast, some sugar and some water and some very clever scientists, and they're producing lots of like GMP grade psilocybin.
Amazing.
It's incredible.
I might open it for questions. I can't see you very well, but feel free to, I think there's a microphone, you can put your hand up. Otherwise, we might get you to come a bit closer. Is there any questions? Otherwise, we can keep talking.
Oh, that's the Power Ranger.
I'm sorry, I can't see very well. I can see an arm. Anybody? Hey. So. I'll just repeat the question. So the question was basically whether a therapist who would prescribe something should experience it themselves first to have that kind of insight. Yeah,
this is quite, again, a hot topic in the space at the moment. We've actually taken a fairly firm stance that no, a psychotherapist doesn't need to have undergone a psychedelic experience. And the reason there is, you know, taking MDMA is very different to taking DMT, is very different to taking LSD. And actually, the experience that I could have on any one of those drugs could be completely different to one that anyone else has had. So it might actually create this kind of false feeling of understanding what someone's going through, which would actually probably be more negative than never having done it, and just being a very kind, compassionate therapist with proper training on how to deal with people in a variety of situations. But as I say, that's the position we've taken, and that's all about helping to mainstream this with kind of the wider system. But I know that others have taken literally the polar opposite view. So,
Interesting. Any more questions? Yep. Hey. So the question was about remote therapy and how some of the logistics around that, I think. That's what I heard.
In terms of logistics, I mean, do you mean
Did we
how
get
is it
that
being
right?
delivered? Like, you know, through a Zoom call, or do you?
Yep. So on-screen digital.
yeah, got it. So, yeah, with our model, basically the preparatory sessions will be done remotely. It's through a specific health compliant technology, but very much like Zoom or Google would be. And they'll do those, yeah, face to face, but on your computer or your phone. Then you come in for the actual dose of the drug itself on site. We'll usually advise one more face-to-face the day after, just because you're in the area anyway. But then going on beyond that, you're back to the remote therapy. But in some trials, we'll give the option, actually, and then it's up to the patient. If they prefer to come in and do it all face-to-face, that's fine as well.
Anybody else? Yeah, hey. Oh, there is a mic. They're just really slow.
Oh,
Is it on?
okay.
Hey.
Now you hear me. Oh, thank you for your interesting discussion. And as we all know that psychedelics are stigmatized. And is it even possible to get the stigma away from the psychedelics? And what do you think about it?
So the question, just in case, was about psychedelics and stigma? And
Yes,
how,
yes. Yeah, and get psychedelics like in ibuprofen level. That it's like a normal thing to do and to use.
Yeah, I remember when I I left my last job in a sort of big corporate management consultancy to jump into psychedelics. There were definitely raised eyebrows from friends and family. There's still a lot of stigma around, I think, but what everyone in this space is trying to do now is to try and normalize it, and I think data really does speak, and as do like quite emotive stories, and I think those are the two things that we need to work on as as our industry, is making sure that people that still have that stigma are seeing the data, seeing how many literally X percentage of people are getting better, versus then maybe there'll be interesting stories from an individual's perspective. Like How to Change Your Mind on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, that's well worth a watch, which does an interesting blend of the two. And I think that's how you kind of try and break that stuff down.
Yeah, I think it's really important to include the patient journey sort of at every step of the way, because who better to inform the way that companies are looking at treating patients than patients who've gone through the treatment themselves. And from a kind of changing public perception perspective, it's really the patient stories that do that. So what we've seen is that when you have polls being taken on the street across various different socioeconomic or demographics, you say, oh, psilocybin for mental health, what do you think of it? And people are like, oh, not sure, that's a scheduled substance. But then when you explain to them how it works, how it would be administered, that it's in a clinical environment with a licensed physician, etc., the stance often softens. And what we've also seen globally is that different stories appeal to different countries. So in the US, for example, where veterans are revered for their acts of service, the veteran story gets a lot of sympathy and changes minds quite quickly. And we are seeing an enormously high suicide rate amongst the veteran population. And veterans are the subset of patients who have benefited the most from some of these treatments. So that softens public perception. What we've seen in Canada and the UK, for example, is that the end-of-life terminal illness story carries a lot of weight and public sympathy. And, you ask someone, how would you feel about someone, in the final stages of cancer receiving this treatment? It's a scheduled substance, but this is how the treatment would be given. The response is often, well, look, this person's dying anyway, so why would we deprive them of the right to come to terms with and make peace with what's happening to them and extend those precious moments that they'll have with their loved ones, removing the fear, the anxiety, and the existential distress that comes with an illness like that. And so I think in terms of changing public perception, reducing stigma, a lot of it is going to be based on the data, but it's also going to be about those compelling stories. And we saw this in the US with cannabis. You can give politicians and lobbyists can use as much data at their fingertips, at their disposal, but when you wheel in a child in a wheelchair who is suffering, and people realize that this is one of the few treatments that works, nothing is more compelling for change. And so I think it's really important that we shine a spotlight on the stories of people who are suffering, 30-year-old patients suffering from breast cancer in the UK who have to travel to the Netherlands to receive these treatments because that's where it's legal.
All right, I think we're out of time. We were late on and blah, blah, blah. But thank you so much, Tom, Clara,
Thank
for
you,
being
Cate.
with us today. And thank
Thanks
you,
very much.
everybody.
Thanks everyone for coming.